Wonderful. All right, thanks, Mom. Let's go ahead and get started. So with your subscription, there are 5 key steps included in the general order of operations, right? And so this first step is to control weeds. The second step is to treat pet spots. Thirdly, patch and seed. Fourthly, fertilize the lawn. And then lastly, control pests. Now, while this is a great overview for the entire season and helps provide a bit more of an explanation in relation to some of our other products, the focus here today is to transition away from this order of operations and really consider a bit more of a dynamic order of operations here. So keep in mind, over the course of the season, the lawn is a dynamic system, right? This isn't a static environment where there aren't separate factors to consider. So these steps aren't necessarily something or actions that you can complete once and then mark them off. They're all useful to keep in mind over the entire year and even in the off season, just to keep in mind essentially how best to proceed. So today we will be starting with by discussing lawn preparation. And so this includes essentially having a better understanding of your specific lawn. So for example, are there any areas which have struggled in years past? Could it be due to compaction? Could it be due to shade? Excess sun exposure? Perhaps we need to discuss auditing your sprinkler system. Are there any soil factors we need to consider? So by completing these steps at the beginning of the season only ensures that you'll have even more success over the course of the season, right? You'll be better prepared for any changes which may occur and know how best to respond. Secondly, we'll discuss controlling weeds and whether Dandelion Doom or Weed Warrior is going to be the best option from out of our products. Thirdly, we'll discuss patching and seeding. So essentially when to seed, whether to seed, and why we place such a heavy emphasis on seeding. Fourthly, fertilizing, the bread and butter, if you will, of the plan, right? The nutrient pouches and when to apply those and key factors to keep in mind. And then lastly, maintaining the lawn. And so this is really a summary slide, just to essentially what to keep an eye out for as we progress through the season. So before I pass it on over to Ivana here, keep in mind that with each of these steps, considering the environmental conditions is critical, right? And so even though we may be at a time where, let's just say you're looking to seed the lawn, if it's a bit too cool or a bit too warm, we may need to adjust our path forward. So while we walk through these steps, please feel free to ask any questions of, well, would this be a good time to complete this? Or what if I'm unable to complete aerating, for example, at this time of year, right? Is there a better time to complete it, or can I still do so in the summer? These are all great questions to ask.
All right, so we're going to start off with lawn preparation. So this is something you can start to kind of think about late winter, early spring, as you start to notice, snow melting or your grass starting to wake up, depending on your location. You don't want to start doing anything until temperatures are about 60 to 75 degrees. And you want to make sure that that kind of stays. Also, if you're planning on doing anything, you want to make sure that's also staying afterward. You don't want like a freeze to happen right after doing anything or applying anything, because it will kind of mess with anything you choose to do. So I know, but when you're looking at your lawn, snow's melting, it's getting a little warmer, kind of take stock of your grass. If there's a ton of, dead material, if you had a ton of thatch over the course of the season, think about renting a dethatcher, starting to remove some of that material. Thatch is good for about a half an inch to a full inch. Anything more than that, you're going to want to remove it so that things can actually come in contact with the soil. It's a really important thing to do for seeding or for applying fertilizer. You just want to make sure that that barrier is permeable. You don't want things to just kind of sit in the grass and not get into the soil. So, if you have some, it's good to remove it. If you're unsure, if you have too much, reach out to us. Webinars that Get Sunday, we can get pictures. So anything you are unsure about, send us a picture and we can talk about it. The next thing to think about would be aerating. So if you notice water pooling on the top of your soil, if you notice maybe you stick a screwdriver into the soil and it's really hard and you don't think that things are able to kind of transfer into the soil, water or fertilizer, air is a really important thing even for grass roots. They do need that air exchange as well. So if you notice that your soil is compacted, you want to be able to loosen that a little bit. So aerating is a great way to do that. as long as you use a core aerator. So that's something that will actually pull plugs of the soil out instead of compacting it further by sticking something in. So there are like a spike aerator, those will compact the soil around the spike, but a core aerator will actually remove the plugs, making it easier for that air exchange to happen. After aerating, you can just break those plugs in. You can also pair it with another practice that I absolutely love and will recommend to basically everybody, which is top dressing. So top dressing is something that is incredibly important if you notice, you get your soil test back from us and it looks like there's a very small amount of organic matter. Organic matter is incredibly important for retaining nutrients, for retaining moisture, just making sure that your soil is healthy. It has a lot of good microorganisms that will help your grass stay healthy and stress-free. So adding a little bit of compost, a little bit of topsoil, only like a quarter inch or so. You don't want to smother your grass, but if you want to aerate and then dump some topsoil on top of there, rake it in, make sure that the grass isn't smothered or anything. That's a really good way to kind of improve your soil over time. It's not a quick fix, but it is something that you'll appreciate it 5 years down the line when your soil is super healthy, your grass is loving it, doesn't need a lot of intervention from you. And in addition to thinking about our soil test, is your soil pH off? So grass can actually handle a pretty wide pH range. For the most part, you won't really need to amend it. So anywhere from a 4.5 to a 9.5 is fine, but anything higher and lower, you may need to amend it because the grass won't be getting the nutrients that it needs. So for example, if your soil is really acidic, your grass isn't going to get enough calcium to build those cell walls and make sure that it's healthy enough to grow strong. So if your soil is too acidic, which is something we do see more in the northern regions, you may need to add some lime. And this is just a powder application. You can spread it over your lawn and it will raise the pH of your soil. This is something you'll most likely need to do a few times because it's not going to make it a noticeable effect just once. So doing it, in the spring over the course of a few years will help. And then on the other side, you may need to lower the pH. So if you've got a very alkaline soil, there are some nutrients that you're not going to be able to access. And that's something that you would want to apply either sulfur powder, or if you want to go a little bit more of a natural route, some peat moss would also be acceptable. Just applying that over the top of your lawn. And again, it's going to take repeat applications. Soil is very resistant to change. So anything you do is going to be a gradual fix. And the last thing you want to take a look at, is leveling, especially in places where it snows a lot, your ground freezes, it thaws, it might create more of a bumpy texture over the course of your lawn. So just kind of checking, walking over it, feeling if there's any bumps. And that's something you can kind of also remediate when top dressing. So you can add a little bit of builder sand, which is a sharper sand. It's one that's not going to compact. If you just mix that with your organic matter, topsoil, or compost, spread that over the lower areas, and it will help even out the surface of your yard.
And Ivana, one of the questions we receive somewhat frequently is what about high sodium levels or high salt levels, right, in gypsum? And typically, we're happy to discuss in more detail, but generally not necessarily required, right?
Right, yeah, it's usually something that you really only need to do in serious cases. It can be a little confusing if you look at your soil test and it shows a high sodium level. It may still be high, but it does interact with other nutrients in your soil to either be a problem or not. So it's a little bit of a complicated situation, but for the most part, remediating sodium is just as easy as switching to a deep and infrequent watering system. Just making sure you're flushing it out of the root zone, making sure that water is just not sitting there and collecting more sodium. So for the most part, just watering deeply and making sure you're flushing it is just fine for sodium. All right. Moving on to our next step would be controlling weeds. And again, this is something you're going to have to do over the course of the season, but as far as just going through the steps for the beginning of the year, this will be the next thing you do after lawn preparation. So just take stock of the weeds you have. Are there something that's, taking over more than it did in the past? Is it something where you've kind of got like a handful mix, you're not really sure, what all of these mean? And then trying to figure out, how to get rid of them. Some things you might just need to change the environment because there's something that will keep coming back if you don't change something about your lawn. But the first thing to think about when controlling weeds is the temperature range. So if you're removing weeds from your lawn, there will be a bare patch, and things that happen bare patches are more weeds come in. So just thinking about, maybe just leaving the weeds there, taking the seed heads away, taking the flowers away so they can't reproduce, but just leaving them in that area so that the soil is not bare. And then you can go ahead and remove those before you seed just to make sure there's no open area for other weeds to kind of slide in. And so something to do, if you start seeing weeds pop up, but it's not quite time to seed yet, would just be to mow those areas, bag your clippings to make sure that you're removing the seeds and the flowers from the area. You can compost those clippings. The temperature in a home compost will get high enough to denature them, or you can, put them in the garden waste bag for your trash pickup as well. But just making sure you remove those weeds from the environment. You don't want them to spread there because then you're going to have an even bigger problem. A lot of these you will be able to hand pull. Things like dandelions, crabgrass for the most part, things like that are going to be pretty easy to remove. Something with like a central taproot, like a dandelion or thistle, will be easier to remove. But some things are not ones that you do want to hand pull. Things like wild violets, the bulbs stay under the soil. So if you pull it, it's probably going to release some other one, something like a nutsedge. If you actually pull a nutsedge, two more will come back like a hydra. So leaving those there, just mowing them, taking stock of them, seeing the conditions that they're living in. Nutsedge and wild violets like a more moist soil. So if you're starting to see those, switch your watering up a little bit, let it dry out between waterings, and you'll be able to kind of get those to stop coming back. And then for the last part of treating weeds, you do want to kind of decide which spot treatments you need to use as far as weed control. So we do have our dandelion doom, which is a broadleaf herbicide. This will, kill dandelions, clovers. It also kills moss, which is super helpful. Not a lot of things will. So moss is a big one. Plantain, anything that's got a thicker leaf than grass, something that's got, if you look at the veins up close, they're more of a spread out kind of vein structure. Um, Anything that kind of looks like an ornamental plant, basically. Something that doesn't look like grass, you can most likely use our dandelion doom on. It is a selective herbicide, so you can spray it on your grass to no effect. It might just be a little bit darker because it is an iron concentrate, but the first watering will take that right off of there. Um, if you have a lot of grassy weeds or something that's a lot harder to kill, you can use our weed warrior. This is not something I recommend applying in your lawn because it will also kill the turf grass. It's non-selective. It doesn't care what it gets on. It's going to harm whatever it touches, basically. The only time I would recommend applying this to your lawn is if your grass is dormant or if you plan to overseed that area. So if you just got a really big patch of crabgrass, you're tired of it, you want it gone, spray it with the weed warrior. Just make sure that you will have to seed that area again because it will also kill the turf grass there as well. But it is also a really good option for any weeds you will get the cracks in your sidewalk, in your landscaping, things like that. You just want to make sure it's not touching any plants you want to keep. And if it does, you want to remove those bits of the plants or seeding the plants if necessary. Okay. Any questions from there, Will?
Nothing so far.
Alrighty. In that case, hand it off to you.
Perfect. All right.
Sorry about that. All right, seeding. So this is something you do after the weeds. So once you've pulled those weeds, getting those out of there, you've got all these bare spots now, or if you've just noticed that you've got some bare spots in the area, you want to make sure that the temperatures are right to seed. So anywhere from 50 to 80 degrees in the daytime, not freezing at night, things like that. This will be the great time to kind of figure out what kind of seed you need. Luckily with cool season grasses, you can kind of seed other grasses between that, increasing the biodiversity. So if you're not sure what kind of grass you have, if you want to make sure you get the same one, feel free to email us pictures to webinars like at Sunday. We'd be happy to help you out and see what kind of grass you need. So when you start the process of seeding, first thing you want to do is remove any dead material that's still in those bare areas. So removing some grass, or if you notice you've got pet spots, this is a great time to use our Pet Patch product. This will, it works as a surfactant, so it will draw out any of the contaminants from pet waste. It'll make sure that it's not sitting in that root zone like sodium we mentioned earlier. It's just something to either apply to your entire lawn if there's a lot of pet spots, or to kind of go individually and just make sure that everything is flushed away. And you want to do that before seeding because that way the seeds don't try to grow into an environment that's not optimal for them. So after you remove dead material, after you've applied the Pet Patch if necessary, you do want to loosen the soil a little bit. If it is a super bare area, rake it up, rough it up, just kind of make sure that that soil has a lot of areas for that seed to fall into. And then you'll seed, you can use a spreader. If you're cheap and lazy, you can use your hand. That's what I do, just like the one days broadcast it with your hands over those areas. And then something that I always recommend is just to cover it. Some people use hay if you want to. There are some issues with weed seeds getting into it, so I usually use some topsoil, just spreading that over the seeds, making sure that they're protected. And it also has the added benefit of just keeping them moist and conditioning your soil over time. So highly recommend just making sure seeds are covered, they're happy, and then you'll start to see some germination from those. And then once you've gotten about 3 weeks or about 60% germination, then we'll start to follow up with our next section there.
And so you brought up a really good point at the beginning here from a temp perspective, right? Everybody wants to get out into the lawn. We see the snow hopefully starting to leave. But so let's just say this weekend's going to be up in the 50s or potentially up into the 60s. But next week it's going to drop down to the 20s or 30s at night. Would you look to seed or would you wait?
I would wait just to make sure you give that seed as much of a chance as possible. Even with the best seed, there's going to be ones that don't germinate for a variety of reasons. You just want to make sure as you're seeding, get your money's worth. Make sure that it is the optimal time for that seed to go down so it has the best germination, the best growth possible.
All right, and transitioning to fertilizing. So the key points to keep in mind here, as we know, this is with the nutrient pouches, this is the bread and butter, right? This is really the key component of your plan, but it's still crucial to keep in mind that we need to consider the environmental conditions, right? And so with each subscription, you will have your My Plan page providing recommended application dates. And so you're able to complete the checklist and keep track of which ones you have left over, which ones may you still have to complete this season. But the key point to keep in mind is that the grass needs to essentially benefit from these pouches. So what does that mean? Well, we recommend applying these pouches as long as the temp range is between roughly 50 to 85 degrees or so. Now, during the summertime, if it's getting up to, let's say, 90 degrees during the day, of course, I would look to apply potentially in the morning when it's a bit cooler and we can fit that application window from a temp perspective. But I wouldn't necessarily rely on that as your key factor to consider. Instead, I would consider if the grass is currently stressed. And so if the grass is stressed, I would not apply the pouch. Any fertilizer, if we apply it to stressed grass, that's not what we want to be encouraging, right? We want to encourage healthy growth when the grass can benefit from it. So if the grass is not currently growing or if it's stressed, hold off onto those nutrient pouch applications, even if it means that we're going to have to adjust the application dates on your My Plan page a bit, right? There's a good amount of flexibility here where we'll be able to incorporate leftover pouches over the course of the season. So I strongly recommend keeping the healthy and actively growing factors in mind, and then deciding based on the temp window. Secondly, from a mowing perspective, when to apply the nutrient pouches before a mow is not a bad idea, right? Or essentially, let me rephrase that. Mowing before an application is not a bad idea. Essentially, that'll help open up the grass canopy, if you will, right? Make sure that essentially that the content of the pouch isn't going to essentially just evaporate and it's essentially going to reach the soil. But after a mow, we do recommend wait after an application. Man, this is one of those days where I like to say mow instead of application. After an application, we do recommend waiting at least 2 days before mowing the lawn, just to make sure we're essentially not cutting off that new growth and allowing enough time for that pouch to be absorbed. From a watering perspective, we do recommend if the lawn is healthy, but is essentially needs a bit of water, right? You haven't had much rain recently, then I would consider a light watering, right? So with the application of the pouch, we wouldn't consider this to be a deep and infrequent watering, right? Which is what we recommend if you are watering with a sprinkler system. So essentially just light watering to essentially, but allow that pouch to be best absorbed. And then after an application, keep in mind that since the pouches are liquid, we want to make sure that we're not essentially just flushing them, right? So from a rain perspective, we want to try to ensure that there isn't rain in the forecast for at least 24 hours. And if you do decide to run the sprinklers or a hose on sprayer, also make sure to wait at least 24 hours or so. If a random thunderstorm rolls in and you end up receiving a good amount of rain, it's difficult to determine how best to proceed, right? So always feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but ideally hold on to those applications if possible, just so we don't have to worry about if the pouch has been flushed, essentially. We do offer a couple of pouches which do not contain nitrogen, so I did just want to highlight these. So Lawn Aid, for example, is a preventive summer stress treatment. So this is a pouch which even we could essentially put down before the summer heat settles in, but would not necessarily result in a green up of the lawn. Still a beneficial pouch. And not necessarily as common for up north, but more so further south with like Florida with fertilizer blackout dates. Green out is an additional pouch which may be sent essentially without any nitrogen, phosphorus, just to help to essentially enhance the soil if there are dates where we're unable to apply fertilizer. But again, the Lawn Aid would be the more common pouch for further north, and just wanted to highlight that there are some which do not contain any nitrogen. All right, and then lastly, transitioning to maintaining. So over the course of the season, we've walked through, we've prepared the lawn to have a better understanding of what is occurring. We've controlled the weeds, we've been repairing the lawn, we've been applying the nutrient pouches. Well, what if we notice some changes in the lawn? So again, keep in mind, if you notice a change, we want to consider the temp range. So if you experienced a sudden increase in temps, then potentially we need to consider if there's a correlation with the weather. If there was a sudden decrease in temp, then maybe there was a cooler weather or frost, which could have set the grass back a bit. So temperature is a key factor to keep in mind. Could be a change in the amount of precipitation. So as we progress through the season, potentially in the summertime, we may start to see signs of heat or drought stress. So it's critical to keep in mind if there could be a correlation there. And then lastly, if you do have a sprinkler system, have you completed an audit of it recently, just to make sure essentially the entire lawn is receiving coverage? From there, we do recommend keeping track of these changes. So if you do notice any areas of the lawn starting to yellow or to change, take note of it just so you're able to reference these points if you do chat with one of us. And then lastly, develop a plan of how best to proceed. So one of the questions we commonly receive is, okay, my grass isn't greening up, I need to apply fertilizer, right? Well, that's not always the case. So this image here could be more common in the fall, potentially, and this may be a number of factors. So if we start to see brown patches, this could be essentially a fungal bloom, which typically means that there's been an excessive amount of moisture. So we could discuss auditing the sprinkler system. We could discuss looking to see if the soil is compacted and if we essentially need to improve drainage. This could end, so essentially, or this could essentially be, are there just areas where essentially we need to top dress or to essentially overhaul the area? Now, the key point here is that if we took the sort of default action of applying fertilizer, if this is actually a fungus, in most situations that will actually exacerbate the issue. And in most conditions, or in most situations, we're able to essentially, as long as we modify that environment, cut back on the water, we won't necessarily need to repair the lawn or essentially take a more comprehensive plan. Now, more common for the cool season grasses would be snow mold, especially this year where it's been above freezing for a good portion of the winter, but potentially with snow starting to melt, right? And so when there isn't consistent snow coverage, or it's just a little bit warmer than above freezing, then we can start to see these patches develop in the lawn as the snow starts to melt. So if you see these patches beginning to develop, what we do recommend is essentially raking up that material, getting a bit of grass seed installed, fertilize the area as the grass starts to wake up. But from a long-term perspective, we would be looking to essentially improve drainage, minimize the amount of snow that remains in the area, and just try to minimize the chance of this area remaining wet. So again, this isn't necessarily an area where if I saw this start to develop in the springtime, that I would just default to applying fertilizer, right? I would take a bit more of a comprehensive approach and actually repair it. Thirdly, though, here is a picture again from Michigan State, and this again could be a number of factors, but this is primarily a turfgrass pest. So potentially, especially for a cool season grass. Grubs can be a common pest. And so again, this is an area where if we essentially apply fertilizer, we're most likely going to exacerbate the issue since the grass is already stressed. So this would be a situation where if we're able to identify, okay, this doesn't correlate with a change in the weather per se, a spike in the temps could exacerbate this or make the symptoms worse as well, but it will keep that out of mind for right now. So essentially, if it seems like this area doesn't seem to correlate with any changes within the lawn either, right, from a soil perspective, then we would start to chat about a pest and essentially look to develop a plan to repair the area. So again, third section where fertilizer wouldn't be the optimal plan for improving the section. And then lastly, could be heat stress, right? So in the summertime, this tends to be the time where we see the majority of issues begin to develop. During the spring, natural precipitation may be helping to minimize the impact of other stressors. And then as the temps start to warm up, as the natural amount of precipitation decreases, then we could start to see a number of factors begin to appear. So if you do live in an area where you start to see the grass start to yellow during the summer, and we do determine that's essentially heat stress, we have a couple of options. We could discuss watering and essentially just making sure we're promoting a deepened and frequent schedule, but it's also possible to essentially allow that grass to go dormant, right? Enter dormancy during the summer heat. And once the temps start to drop in the fall time, we can incorporate those remaining nutrient pouches and proceed from there. So again, a situation where in the summertime, if the grass is stressed due to heat stress, we would not default to applying fertilizer. I realize we're running out of time here, so if anybody does need to leave, like I said, we will be sending the recording. Truly appreciate being here today. But just as a brief recap, so if you find that there are areas that are starting to yellow, if the area has weak roots, it could be a turfgrass pest. If the area has almost a spongy or discolored appearance, it could be a fungus or a fungal bloom starting to take hold. And if you have almost a dry feeling or a bluish grayish hue, footprints remaining in the lawn, this could be a sign of drought stress. So the key takeaway here, there are a number of factors which could appear over the course of the season. We could spend an entire webinar discussing these. But as long as you have a better understanding, essentially, you've prepared the lawn, you have an understanding of the different areas throughout the lawn, then we'll be better able to identify the correct stressor and then modify our plan or path of action accordingly.
So we did have a couple questions come in. I realized that I did answer them, but I wanted to kind of touch on them a little bit more. We did not go over granular fertilizers, so that was a great call out. Granular fertilizers will remain in the lawn for longer. That's why you have less applications in your schedule. So it's totally okay if it starts to rain, before or after applying. They're meant to last in the soil for a long time. So it's totally fine to apply, if it rains right after, that's okay. I would still recommend just giving a quick mow beforehand just to let that granular fertilizer get better contact with the soil. And then we did also have a question about pet spots and just seeding before applying pouches. I would definitely recommend seeding before applying those pouches, in your case, active lawn, unless it's something that you just want to get down now to help your grass. So if you notice you just want a quick pick me up, go ahead and apply that pouch, and then your next application should be around when that grass seed grows. If you'd rather hold on to it and apply it after the grass seed starts to sprout, that is usually what I recommend, just so that all of that grass gets, a boost from that pouch. Just, again, more bang for your buck, making sure those new seeds benefit from that pouch as well.
And I do believe we had a couple of questions submitted prior to the webinar, one being essentially which products, if any, interact negatively with Sunday's products. Keep in mind that there are a number of different products, so we'd be happy to provide additional details, but generally our primary focus is if the product contains nitrogen, waiting at least 3 weeks before applying our nutrient pouches just to minimize the risk of over-fertilization. And that's the primary factor, but we can certainly discuss in more detail.
And then I think we did also have one about pet safety. Just keep in mind, anything not meant to be ingested, might be an issue. So if there's something that you want questions about or have questions about further, if it's a specific thing, feel free to reach out to us so we can chat about it. But our products are made with safety in mind. We do take steps to ensure that these are going to be the best possible things for your family. So any specific questions, feel free to reach out to us at webinars at Get Sunday.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Just as a brief recap of resources, we do have our blog, The Shed, which is a great resource providing articles discussing how to complete practices such as how to test for compaction. That was one of my favorite topics to bring up today. Our YouTube channel is a great resource as well, providing product overviews, chats with our very own Dr. Frank Rossi, and also examples of essentially how to complete some of these practices. So how to audit your sprinkler system, for example. And as Ivana mentioned, please submit any questions to the webinars at Get Sunday email address. We're always happy to chat. We're here 7 days a week from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Mountain Time. But with that, like we said, keep an eye out for the follow-up survey. This was order of operations cool season. Is cool season long, Ivana? Order of operations?
For cool season long, yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, it was an absolute pleasure, everyone. We truly appreciate being here today, and we'd be thrilled to see you at a future webinar. So have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Take care, y'all.